Okay, no fooling around. This is a really important video, to tell you the truth. Over the last 2-3 days, Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense for the Russian Federation, has called, at his initiation, the Secretaries of Defense of the United States and their counterparts in France and the United Kingdom and Turkey. Now, this is officially known. And the subject matter of these conversations is not known specifically, but it is believed that Shoigu said that the Zelensky regime is planning to use a dirty bomb on the territory of Ukraine, that this would be a provocation / escalation. The foreign ministries of France, the United Kingdom, and the United States issued a joint statement saying that they would keep on supporting Ukraine and that these allegations, these Russian allegations, were false, and they insinuated in the joint statement that it was really the Russian Federation that was creating an excuse for escalation. I'll read you the specific joint statement, which is very interesting. We, the foreign ministers of France, the United Kingdom, and the United States, reiterate our steadfast support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in the face of Russia's ongoing aggression. We remain committed to continue supporting Ukraine's efforts to defend its territory for as long as it takes. Earlier today, the defense ministers of each of our nations spoke to Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu at his request. Our countries made clear that we all reject Russia's transparently false allegations that Ukraine is preparing to use a dirty bomb on its own territory. The world would see through any attempt to use this allegation as a pretext for escalation. We further reject any pretext for escalation by Russia. The foreign ministers also discussed their shared determination to continue supporting Ukraine and the Ukrainian people with security, economic, and humanitarian assistance in the face of President Putin's brutal war of aggression. End statement. Now, it's highly unusual for these three countries to issue a joint statement like this. And the fact that Shoigu has never before called these individuals over the last several months, and he called them all, one after the other, including Turkey, which was not included in this joint statement. It seems to me that the Russians probably have this evidence cold. They know it. They know it for a fact. It is, if Sergei Shoigu would reach out to these his counterparts at these four nations, there is no question that the Russians have absolute proof, absolute and irrefutable proof. And what the foreign ministers of these three countries are doing is lying. Simple as that. I mean, it's not like they haven't done it before. Shoigu would never put himself out on a limb like that unless they had just absolutely foolproof evidence. Now, yesterday I did a video discussing the 101st Airborne Division's deployment in Romania, and also the maneuvers going on of the Polish-Lithuanian army on the border with Belarus. And I blue-skied maybe that this is some sort of fist that they're preparing to hit the Russians, on the Belarusian border or something like that, or the Ukrainian border. But now it seems to me that if what Sergei Shoigu is saying, that the Zelensky regime is preparing a dirty bomb that they are going to detonate on their own territory, which I believe, then it seems reasonable that the intent would be Nikolaev. Nikolaev is one of the coastal cities of Ukraine on the Black Sea. It's between Kherson and Odessa. And this escalation and the fact that Nikolaev has been evacuated of civilians, well, it would seem reasonable to infer that they plan to set off this dirty bomb in Nikolaev, and the West use that as a pretext to deploy the 101st Airborne Division in Odessa. Because if you look at a map, there is Kherson, further west is Nikolaev, and farther still is Odessa. Now, Odessa has historically is a very important city to the Russians. It's important for historical reasons. It's important for religious reasons, cultural reasons. It is a jewel that the Russians have deliberately not harmed, except in targeting specific military assets that have been there. Now, it's very clear that the Zelensky regime forces are at the very end of their tether. There has been a lot of talk from different sources that, in fact, the number of dead Zelensky regime forces numbers in the six figures, over 100,000 dead, and perhaps 1.5 to 2 times that number of wounded, incapacitated. So basically, as Brian Berletic over at the New Atlas has been saying for a while now, the Zelensky regime forces are at their end. And so, in desperation, the Zelensky regime would use this dirty bomb in Mykolaiv, and this would give the excuse for the Americans to deploy in Odessa, and this would escalate the war into a full-on NATO versus Russia war. I think it was very smart of the Russians to come out with this and say openly that this is what the Zelensky regime is planning to do. I think it is despicable what the Zelensky regime is planning to do, because I will say here, and I don't care, there is no doubt in my mind that this is true. And it really, really scares me. I mean, through this whole conflict, this is the one time I have to say that I'm truly scared. Because detonating a dirty bomb, quite apart from creating an environmental catastrophe on Mykolaiv, as a military matter, it will do nothing. Okay, it will just make a big mess, though it should be pointed out that because of this, it would be very difficult for the Russians to advance on Odessa. Because, of course, the coastal roads from Kherson to Mykolaiv onto Odessa would make it extremely difficult for the Russians to advance. It would create a nightmare, and of course a political nightmare. And of course it would draw in the United States. The United States would have the perfect excuse to help a friendly nation. This is the October surprise. This is being done strictly for American electoral purposes, insofar as using a dirty bomb. I have been hearing talk about a dirty bomb for a couple of months at least, but I didn't give it that much credence until now. Now, of course, since the very get-go of this conflict, the Zelensky regime has had the possibility to create a dirty bomb. Because, of course, they have nuclear reactors, and they have the fissionable material. They do potentially, in theory at least, have the technological capacity to make an actual nuclear weapon. But insofar as making a dirty bomb, they certainly have that ability. Insofar as actually making a nuclear weapon, I think it would be, as a theoretical matter, possible, but as a practical matter, really impossible, because the Russians would probably bomb any facility actively trying to do this. I think that part of this missile offensive that the Russians have been carrying out over the past 2 weeks has been to target the potential sectors or installations where they might be assembling a dirty bomb. But I have to reiterate, there is no doubt in my mind that this is real. This is as real as it gets. Sergei Lavrov just gave a statement that I listened to about, he was reacting to the joint statement of the foreign ministers of the United States, the UK, and France. He didn't seem to be saying much, but just basically reiterating what Shoigu was saying, and of course that they had proof. I think that that's the key issue. They have proof. This is real. And I think that I have to go back to the same thing I said just now. I think it's despicable. It is the most despicable thing, and it's desperation. Simple, plain and simple. Because NATO and the Zelensky regime know that they are losing. They are losing badly on all fronts. Economic, political, geopolitical, insofar as the other great nations, China, India, the global south. They are losing economically, and they are losing militarily. They have thrown everything but the kitchen sink at Ukraine to fight off the Russians, and they have lost. Every offensive has been a disaster. Because remember, you don't fight to win territory, you fight to defeat the opposing army. If you destroy the opposing army, that's how you win. And the Russians have been doing that systematically. And as the numbers have come out now, that show catastrophic losses on the Zelensky regime side, it's pretty obvious that there is about to be a huge breakthrough, and in their panic and desperation, the West, Washington, the people at the State Department, the usual suspects, Anthony Blinken, Victoria Nuland, all of these people want a Samson solution, the self-destruction of Ukraine, and a pretext for the Americans to go in and fight against the Russians directly. This is a catastrophe. I mean, I truly cannot emphasize this enough. We're just going to have to wait and see what happens. In my own case, if you're wondering, I'm far, far away from Nikolaev, and so nothing will happen to me, I hope at least. But there's other things too that's been going on. There have been a lot of talk from different troops that they are Zelensky regime troops, that they are getting chemical, biological, and nuclear protection gear and Geiger counters. This is as real as it gets. This is actually happening. I mean, all of these data points add up to this being absolutely true. The foreign ministers of the United States and the United Kingdom and France are lying through their teeth when they say that this is just some sort of pretext that the Russians have conjured up out of thin air. And I mean, I really am at a loss for words, to tell you the truth. And I'm not kidding. I've never been this scared. This is truly a catastrophe if this happens. And it's not so much that the Americans will deploy their 101st Airborne Division in Odessa. It's just going to be a swirling whirlpool. It'll just suck in everything, all the armies of NATO, for a full-on war on the battlefield of Ukraine. And this country that has suffered enough, it will be decimated like nothing before ever. And so I have to say that I'm truly scared for the first time in this conflict, that this entire country will be just absolutely annihilated if the Americans proceed with their grotesque and despicable plan, because ultimately I blame the Americans. The Americans. They're behind this bullshit. And I have to say outright and openly, they are evil. It's not more complicated than that. They are evil, grotesque people. And I hope that at some point in the future, the people responsible for this are tried, for this is a crime against Ukraine and a crime against humanity. This is evil, what they are doing. Sorry, I'm a little bit bent out of shape by this, but as you can imagine, I'm at a loss. I cannot believe that these people would be so evil to pursue this, but they are. And anybody who tells you otherwise, anybody who tells you that this is a Russian false flag or some nonsense like that, they are lying. Know it. Know what's going on. In my earlier video today, I talked about the possibility of a dirty bomb, and that a lot of the diplomatic activity that's been going on, specifically the calls that Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, made to his counterparts in the UK, in the United States, and France and Turkey, that it looked like some sort of false flag, some sort of like basically the explosion of a dirty bomb on Ukrainian soil by the Zelensky regime. Now, not everybody is on board with this. And a lot of people are thinking that maybe Zelensky and his crew of despicable individuals, are doing this all on their own. I disagree. I think that this is something planned up by the United States. This is a deliberate provocation, a deliberate attempt to escalate the war into an open warfare between NATO, the United States, and Russia. Now, let me explain my rationale. First of all, we have to always remember the Nord Stream bombings. Those were carried out by the Americans. And because of those bombings, there is no way for Europe to get the energy resources it will need this winter. So this was a deliberate act of sabotage by the Americans that deliberately will lead to immeasurable suffering in the European Union, among the people of the European Union. So that's the first data point we have to keep in mind. These people do not care about collateral damage. And anything they say about humanity and saving people and blah, 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 it's all lies. They are psychopaths, all of them. The destruction of Nord Stream proves that. And the fact that the leaders of the Western European nations did not call out the obvious culprit of that grotesque act of terrorism, which was the United States, that just shows that the Western leadership class, they are in the back pocket of the Americans. And so they don't count, they're nobodies. And if I ever come across any of them, I'll just spit in their faces and not feel a bit bad about it, because they have betrayed their own people. And you who are in Western Europe, by the way, parenthetically, in France, in Germany, in Sweden, Denmark, all across Europe, you don't have a democracy. You are vassal states. And your job is to pay your taxes and be milked by your betters. Your cattle, your nobodies. Okay? That's what your leaders think of you. Anyway, to go back to the issue of the Nord Stream terrorist act of the Americans. They destroyed that pipeline. So that shows that they are willing to do whatever it takes to win this conflict. Now, it's inescapable that the Zelensky regime forces are losing catastrophically. And now, with this partial mobilization of the Russians, they are going to sweep the whole country. That's inevitable. Now, certain data points that we have to keep in mind. Number one, the Americans deployed the 101st Airborne Division in Romania. Why Romania? They could have deployed in Poland, in Germany. There are lots of other places on the European continent where they could have been deployed, but why Romania? You look at the map and you realize that Romania is in striking distance from Odessa. In fact, from Romania, from the base where the 101st Airborne Division is currently acclimating, it's a straight line of just a few hundred kilometers to get to Odessa. Nothing in between. Number one. Number two, the town of Nikolaev, which is on the road between Kherson, which is currently controlled by the Russians, and Odessa, which is currently controlled by the Zelensky regime. Well, Nikolaev is right on that road, on that coastal road between those two cities. Any offensive to capture Odessa would have to go down that road. And at this time, the people of Nikolaev, of all the people in that region of Ukraine, of southern Ukraine, of all the people in Ukraine, that's the only town that they are evacuating, the only city that they're evacuating. And it's a big city, not as big as Kharkov or Kiev, of course, but fairly a large size, I think a few 100,000 people. Now they are being evacuated. Not Kryvyi Rog, not Zaporozhye, which is right there in front of the Russian troops in the region of Zaporozhye, but the capital city, the namesake city, Zaporozhye, has not been captured by the Russians, and they are not evacuating. Neither is Dnipropetrovsk, which is further north. No, the only town that the Zelensky regime controls that is being actively evacuated is Nikolaev. Third data point. It is known that Zelensky regime forces are being given NBC combat gear, suits that protect against nuclear, biological, and chemical attack, and they are also being issued Geiger counters. Now, you add up these points, that they are evacuated Nikolaev, that their own troops have protective gear against nuclear contamination, and you recognize that the 101st Airborne Division is in Romania in a straight line to Odessa. And what does this tell you? That this is a staged plan. The idea is to set off a dirty bomb in Nikolaev, and that way block the potential advance of the Russian army from Kherson to Odessa. And in the meantime, because of this dirty bomb, which will be blamed on the Russians, the Americans will deploy their 101st Airborne Division in Odessa, and Odessa will be the point where they start to assemble forces, American forces, to fight the Russians. Now you can say that Turkey has blocked the Bosphorus, which they have. They've blocked it from any military warship. But if Erdogan's arm is twisted hard enough, the Americans figure that they will be able to go through the Bosphorus and be able to deploy their ships with their troops in the Black Sea and land them in Odessa. That, I think, is the general plan. Perhaps many of these troops can be airdropped from Romania. Perhaps some of them can come in from Moldova. It doesn't matter the mechanics of it. But it seems clear that what they intend to do is capture Odessa, which is a city near and dear to the Russians, a city that the Russians, for historical and political and social and religious reasons, they do not want to harm, use that blackmail, basically, to prevent the Russians from attacking their forces that are going to be staged there. And so I think that that is the plan. I do not believe that the idea of a dirty bomb is something that the Zelensky regime just dreamed up all on its own. No, that doesn't make any sense. And that Shoigu called the ministers of defense of the United Kingdom, the United States, and France. He probably showed them some intelligence, not all of it. Of course, he won't want to reveal sources and methods and some other sensitive data that if he were to reveal it, it would give the opportunity for the Zelensky regime to change it, i.e. move that dirty bomb wheresoever it's being assembled. But he must have given them enough for that joint statement that they issued, claiming that this was all a Russian fantasy. It's not a Russian fantasy. I mean, the more I think about it, the more I am absolutely clear and sure that the Russians have this information cold. There is no reasonable explanation why Shoigu would call up on a weekend these ministers of defense of Turkey, France, the UK, and the United States. Just for shits and giggles? No, that doesn't make any sense. And call them one after the other. No. This is real. This is as real as it gets, as real as a heart attack. And all the evidence, all the data points at this time points to a deliberate provocation that is being staged by the Americans. The Zelensky regime has been talking about a dirty bomb for a long time. Before the outbreak of the conflict at the Munich conference of Western leaders, Zelensky was openly talking about Ukraine having nuclear weapons. That was part of the reason that the Russians were so freaked out and went ahead with a special military operation. Now, the Zelensky regime has from the get-go had the means to create a dirty bomb. And I think that as it is clear that the Zelensky regime, their forces are losing catastrophically on the battlefield, they are lashing out. For the entire conflict, they have been trying to rope in NATO. And so Washington, who knows who, the usual suspects there, have come up with this insane, evil idea of having the Zelensky regime set off a dirty bomb in Nikolaev, blame it on the Russians, and in the heat of the moment, and with all the incredible news spin that they have, blame the Russians and convince the American people to go to war against Russia. This would not be the first time that the United States went to war under false premises. The USS Maine, the Gulf of Tonkin, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and there are others. It's not the first time that the people in political power in the United States have manipulated the people with false information and false flags in order to get them to go to war with the enemy that they want. One could argue that even Pearl Harbor was almost a false flag in the sense that Franklin Roosevelt so provoked the Japanese that some sort of reaction from them was inevitable. So this is not new. And the most recent example, the weapons of mass destruction, do recall that many of the people who were advising the Bush administration to go to war with Iraq are many of the same people who are in power now or who are power adjacent and who influence the people who are currently pulling the levers of power in Washington. So this is not new of them lying through their teeth in order to get the United States to go to war. I mean, it truly is evil. And if this dirty bomb goes off in Nikolaev, there'll be so much spin and so much bullshit that everybody will be too confused to realize what's going on. So I'm doing this video in the hope that you pass it along to some friend, especially in the United States, so that they know what's happening here, understand what's really going on here. The Americans are planning this false flag using the Zelensky regime for this dirty bomb in Nikolaev, so as an excuse to deploy troops in Odessa and from Odessa start fighting the Russians. And they don't seem to understand that for the Russians this is life or death, and that means that they are going to annihilate the Americans. They are going to crush them. And I would be extremely surprised if any of those men of the 101st Airborne Division actually lands alive on Odessa. Truly. Because I think that once that plane takes off from Romania to get to Odessa, the Russians are going to blow it out of the sky. Because they're not going to wait, and they're not going to hesitate. And all the nonsense that the Western media has been spouting about how the Russians are so bad, they're so incompetent, so this and that, the other. The Russians are exceptionally good at war. I mean, they truly are exceptionally good at war. And the Americans are about to find out. The volunteers who came here at the beginning of the conflict, they all ran away because they got one taste of what the Russians can dish out, and they wanted none of it. God knows how many countless people are going to be killed, because what will happen is that once the Russians wipe out the Americans, which they will, the American leadership class will escalate even more. This has to stop now. If it continues, it's going to spiral out of control. The Americans land at Odessa, the Russians wipe them out. And they're going to, feel bad about blowing up Odessa, not with nuclear weapons, just with their regular artillery. They'll feel bad about it, but they'll get over it because, see, protecting Odessa is a priority, but making sure that it's not controlled by the Americans, that's a top priority for the Russians. And those Army airborne, they will be killed, and this will lead to greater escalation by the Americans, and the Russians will counter that escalation by wiping out the Americans once again, not with nuclear weapons, with conventional, because they can do it. They've got the missiles, they've got everything necessary to win. And eventually, in this escalation that will be awfully fast, the Americans are going to decide to drop a nuclear weapon, an actual bona fide nuclear missile fired at the Russians, and then all bets are off. This has to stop now. This has to stop now, because nobody knows how this can end. And it's going to end badly for all involved.